Okay, in the previous lecture we looked at the formalized rights that members of a democratic society are expected to get, those that are provided by the government as well as protected by the government. In this lecture I want to look at the flip side of rights, which is responsibilities. And when I say the flip side, I don't mean the opposite of it, I mean that it's the other aspect of membership in a democratic society. You have rights and responsibilities. What are those rights and responsibilities, or excuse me, what are those responsibilities that will complement the rights? Remember that democracy is supposed to be a system of a system of government of, by, and for the people. That is definitely true, and what that indicates or asserts is that a democratic system is supposed to, as I've said numerous times, definitely in the last lecture, seek the will of the people, try to figure out what the will of the people is, and manifest that in terms of policy outcomes. That is government of, by, and for the people. There is a sense in which democracy is also government from the people. This is where we get into the question that is the central question today. What do we need from, what do we expect from the people? A democratic system gives to the people the rights, power, and the orientation towards the interests and values of the people, the will of the people. But what is needed to come back in the other direction? And this is an extraordinarily important point, and it's going to be the focus of the rest of the lectures for this module. So here's the question that I'm going to address. What values, attitudes, dispositions, and actions are needed from the people? There are two sets of these. There are formal citizen responsibilities that are actually then built into either the Constitution or statutory law or regulations, and then there are the informal responsibilities, the things that really citizens have not a legal, constitutional, official, formal responsibility for, but informal in the sense that without these things, we could have a democratic system on paper, but we're not going to have a democratic society more broadly. The existence of a democratic society relies on a combination of formal structures, laws, procedures, rules, institutions, the arrangements of the institutions, and the participation of citizens and non-citizens, members of that society, in a particular style of politics that is a democratic style of politics. So I'm going to quickly go through both of these. This is it won't have to be a very long lecture because the ideas here are not necessarily that challenging, that controversial, and they have been discussed in various ways in the other lectures. The next two lectures after this one will be a little bit longer, a little more in depth, because some of the ideas there are probably less familiar to you. The formal responsibilities, there are essentially two classes of them, and I've called them basic and other, which is, we could call, instead of the other, we could call these additional. It's not necessarily that they're optional, it's that there's no set list. The basic responsibilities, and these are formal responsibilities, but they're also really just kind of assumed. Your basic responsibilities as a citizen are to obey the law and pay taxes. And really, in a way, these are the same thing, because tax laws are the laws that you have to obey when you pay taxes. But these two formal responsibilities are typically broken out separately, just to indicate that there are two things that are going on. When you are a citizen of a democratic society, you have an obligation to obey the law, and that is built right in to our legal system, and then you have an obligation to contribute to the funding of the governance system, the democratic system, through taxes. Now, what else is necessary? What else is required of citizens formally? This is where different democratic societies answer this other question. What else is formally required of citizens? Answer it differently. Is jury service required? In most democratic societies, in order to have a functioning legal system, in order to make sure that the legal rights are respected and upheld, one of the important things is citizen participation on juries, and that is often, it is in the United States, mandatory. It's not something that you can decide not to do. Now, there are all kinds of excuses that you can make to get out of jury service, as many people probably have realized. But you don't just get to say, yeah, I don't want to be on juries. Voting. In the United States, voting is not a formal responsibility. You can just say, I don't want to vote. In a society with mandatory voting, you will get fined for not voting. And so you can still not vote, but you are being penalized for it because it is one of your formal responsibilities. There are definitely good arguments for and against making voting one of the formal requirements for a citizen in any democracy. And I won't get into the whole range of arguments there. The main reason to have mandatory voting is that it ensures, it guarantees widespread citizen participation in the fundamental selection mechanism of modern democracies, which is the electoral system. As you should know by now, there are many other selection systems for office holders, selection mechanisms for office holders, but voting is a foundational one, and it's almost always used for the legislature, so direct vote for the legislature. So voting is seen as being the fundamental citizen responsibility, and to have widespread participation, mandatory voting is required. In the United States, the argument against mandatory voting is that a democracy is also a liberty-loving, freedom-preserving type of system. Individual sovereignty is just as important as popular sovereignty. And a democratic system gives everybody the opportunity to participate in the system of popular sovereignty. But if you require people to vote, then you are undermining their individual sovereignty. People who don't want to vote, who choose not to, for whatever reason, either because they don't want to spend the time and they don't want to have to be an irresponsible voter and just be like, I don't want to spend the time, but I have to cast a ballot or I'll pay a fine, or just really to express the notion that a democracy is one, about making sure the will of the people is respected. That's the principle of popular sovereignty. But in addition to political equality and rule of law and checks and balances, limited government, individual sovereignty is a fundamental principle. It's one of the reasons why democracy exists, is to protect individuals' rights. When you tell people they have to vote, you're shrinking the domain of their personal freedom. That is really going to be true for any of the formal responsibilities. You're saying you have to do these things. The reason why these are the basic ones is because if you don't require people to do this, if obeying the law is voluntary, if paying taxes is voluntary, then you don't have a political system at all. You have a voluntary association where it's instead of having taxes, you have dues, and instead of having laws, you have essentially bylaws or some kind of regulations, suggested regulations. You can't have any kind of society at all without these formal responsibilities. But how much more do we expect formally from citizens? There is a balance between popular sovereignty and participation and individual sovereignty, the freedom-loving side. In the United States, we tend to have a very strongly liberty-loving culture, and so the list of other responsibilities is basically just jury service. And it is relatively easy to get out of jury service, and people can actually spend their whole lives not even getting called up for jury service because we have more people around than are necessary to staff all the juries. Further options. A big one I have here, more ... Like what else do we expect from citizens? We might expect all kinds of stuff from them, but everything you add to this list is going to shrink the domain of individual sovereignty. National service, again, is a formal responsibility in a decent number of democratic societies, but not in the United States. There is no service requirement that is asked. There have been proposals, and in the past there has been a draft, which is mandatory military service for men. So this has been on the list at various times in U.S. history, but the basic responsibilities of citizens in the United States do not include any kind of national service. In many countries, there is a national service requirement, and there have been proposals growing with increasing strength over the last decade or so from progressive circles create some kind of national service requirement so that people contribute to the common good directly with their time and their energy, not just with their money and their obedience. And so the question does become, when you want to add other things, is how much do we as a democratic society feel like it's important to bulk up how people are interacting with the system, required interactions, or how much do we want to keep the domain of individual sovereignty, of personal liberty, as large as possible? And we can, this is a way you can essentially tag democracies on a spectrum from social responsibility through liberty-loving, personal, or individualistic. The more we add to the list, the more social responsibility is built in to our democratic system, and the less, the shorter the list, the more individual sovereignty is privileged. Now, obeying the law creates a potential for a large area of social responsibility. For example, if a law were passed that said everybody has to wear masks when they're walking down the street, that is going to shrink our sphere of personal liberty and require personal or social responsibility. One of the debates in a political system like the United States, which has a very liberty-loving lean to its political culture, is whether, even if it's legitimate for, say, a state legislature to pass a law like that, like the Constitution allows that kind of law to be passed, is it good policy? Do we want to let the government take over more and more of our individual choices? So these are questions that apply not just to foundational issues of setting up the citizen responsibilities, but also ongoing regular politics. Every time a new legal responsibility is added through the passage of a law or taxes are increased, that shrinks to a certain extent the domain of individual liberty. So that's what's being done here. When we're looking at citizen responsibilities, we're saying, what do we require from you? Now, the formal responsibilities are really all about actions, right? What actions are required from the people in order to be able to have a democratic system? The informal responsibilities gets into values, attitudes, dispositions, and also actions, and says, okay, there's more than we're going to actually spell out that's needed to have a healthy functioning democracy, but we're going to leave that up to the people to cultivate on their own. It's not going to be done by the government. The government has a responsibility to cultivate obedience to the law and to cultivate the collection of taxes through enforcement mechanisms. And if there are other things added to the formal list, to enforce those as well. The informal responsibilities are left up to the people themselves to cultivate or not cultivate, to nourish or to allow to die out. I have a list here of things that are important for the people in a democratic society to be responsible for doing. All of these things are going to fall short of widespread perfection or widespread manifestation. One of the things that we can see, though, is that the less of any one of these there is, the less vigorous and healthy our democratic society is going to be. And if things start to diminish to a point where it's much more common for the people not to have this sense of responsibility than to have it, then that's sliding a democratic society in an anti-democratic and an authoritarian direction. And I think that when I go through this list, I won't have to elaborate too much on the fact that we in the United States are living through a moment where it does feel as though our democratic society is sliding sort of dangerously close to that precipice of authoritarian, if not an authoritarian government structure, if not an authoritarian leader in charge of things, but an authoritarian society that doesn't actually have the attitudes, dispositions, and actions that uphold a vigorous democracy where the will of the people is being sought and manifested. The first informal responsibility is to stay informed, right? This is not required. There's no requirement that says, okay, you have to stay informed on current events, you have to stay informed on policy, you have to learn about history, U.S. history, you have to learn about government. Some states have educational requirements that promote a baseline of being informed. Interestingly, Oregon, which is often seen as a very progressive state, doesn't have any civics requirement for its public school students. You can go all the way through public school in Oregon and never be required to take a class about how our government works. Interestingly, many states have it, including states that a lot of Oregonians probably look down on as being not very democratic, not very progressive. Texas has a much more vigorous set of educational requirements for its citizens to learn Texas history, U.S. civics, Texas civics, and there's a promoting of Texas pride that's done through that, but there's also an element to which it's making sure that citizens of Texas are informed about what the political system looks like. In Oregon, we don't have that. That's not a formal requirement, right? This is could be added to the more list, like you have to learn how to learn what our civics, our system of government looks like. More over here could be a civics requirement built into every person's education. Staying informed, though, is beyond just learning the basics of how our system of government works and what our history is about knowing what's going on. The reason why knowing what's going on is important is that if a democratic system is fundamentally aimed towards seeking and manifesting the will of the people, how will the people even know what their will is or should be if they don't know what's going on in the world? If they don't know what the crises are, what the problems we face, what the policy alternatives are, what other people think, what's happening in other countries. If you don't stay informed, you can't really have a will of the people. So this is a really important one. Care about the democratic system. Not everybody has to be actively involved or deeply engaged, and when we don't have voting as a requirement, people don't even have to necessarily engage in that one basic sporadic civic act. But if people don't care about our democratic system, if it doesn't matter to them that we have a democracy or not, then a democratic system is definitely going to limp along with only a small percentage of people caring about it. So there has to be not necessarily widespread engagement, but there has to be widespread caring. People have to value democracy, right? And then this connects to the next one, which is uphold basic democratic principles. People have to accept the ideas that are built in, if you go back to the beginning of the course, that are built into democracy. Popular sovereignty, political equality, rule of law, limited government, individual rights. These are things that are values that if the people in a democratic society don't accept those as important, if they seem like, rule of law, like whatever, let's have a legal system where it's your connections and your power and your money that determines the outcomes, as opposed to a legal system that treats everybody equally and blindly. If people don't care about the rule of law, it's not going to be manifested, because the rule of law, like all of the democratic principles, really are, they can be enforced in certain ways, but they have to be upheld in people's beliefs and actions in order for those enforcement mechanisms to matter. We could have courts of law with juries and judges and all the procedures we have right now, but if the people on the jury, if the judges, if the lawyers don't really care about the rule of law, and don't act in those institutions and through those rules and procedures in a way that shows that the rule of law matters, then it's going to be, then the court system is going to essentially be a farce. It will be a play. It won't actually be a system of justice. The same thing is true for any of the democratic values. People have to believe in political equality. You have to believe that every other member of society, every citizen is the same as you, has the same weight. Because if you don't believe that every other member of the democratic society counts equally to you, then if your side loses an election to people that you don't think count, then you're not going to accept the legitimacy of that election. Those people don't matter. They're not true Americans. They're not true X, whatever X is, whatever our nation is. And that's when the notion of political equality has been eroded strongly to the point where people don't recognize the legitimacy of democratic processes that require ultimately counting up people's votes. That feeds into these two, which I think are really kind of corollaries of upholding the basic democratic principles, but I thought it would be useful to spell them out, particularly because I think that right now we can see how these informal responsibilities of citizens are seeming frayed in the United States. And there's some legitimate concern about whether our political culture is sliding towards that precipice of authoritarianism, because more and more people seem to not be upholding these responsibilities. Number one, accept the outcomes of political competition, right? Accept when you lose elections. Accept when a law gets passed that you didn't want because the representatives got elected by other people that you didn't vote for. Or is the representatives, you voted for people who didn't win, and the representatives passed laws you don't like. And then see others as opponents rather than as enemies. The democratic system is a fierce, fierce competition. It's high stakes. The outcomes of the system of governance affect the choices we can make because our fundamental basic responsibility is to obey the law. Whatever the laws are going to increase or decrease our personal liberty, are going to put certain burdens on us that we might not like, are going to put certain burdens on other people that we might like to have on them. The outcome of a democratic system is high stakes and fiercely competitive. And one of the underlying needs is to make sure that that fierce competition is conducted in a way that doesn't lead people to think of politics as a war of all against all. The people need to think of politics as a potentially messy, very fierce, highly competitive search for the will of the people, search for the common good, search for answers to the problems that everybody faces, and an attempt to find those answers and then manifest them in what the government does and what we as individual people do. To the extent that people begin to see their political opponents as enemies, that search for the common goods, for the will of the people, begins to become essentially a battle to win. And when citizens in a democratic system are seeking just to win, not to prevail, but to win, there's a difference between these two. Then there's a movement, I think, towards not really accepting the outcomes of political competition, saying, well, we couldn't have lost, or we lost the vote, but we're on the right side of God, so we're not going to allow the outcome of this election to take place because those people had more votes, but they're wrong, and they're not the real people. So citizens have this responsibility. And as I say, these two are really corollaries of uphold basic democratic principles. There are other, I would say, corollaries of this informal responsibility that could be that we could tease out. And usually we're going to see these things when they seem to be eroding. I put these two up only because there's a lot of concern that these two informal responsibilities of citizens are starting to erode, or have been eroding for a long time, but are starting to erode in such a way that we are becoming legitimately concerned about the health of our democratic system. So this stuff, and I'm going to return to this when I talk about democratic political culture in the final lecture of this module, but this stuff is fundamentally important. If we don't get these things from citizens, we can have a democratic system that is of, by, and for the people on paper and in terms of the mechanics, but the outcome is not going to be a sort of legitimate search for the will of the people.